What's going on, guys? This is Rob, and if you're enjoying the content here on my channel, then make sure you hit the like button and make sure you hit subscribe so you can help decide what direction the content on my channel goes in the foreseeable future. Okay, we're getting into X-Men Deadly Genesis, and to be honest, there are a couple of stories that we've left out so far. A lot of those stories are because I'm just kind of pacing them out to cover them later on. For example, Uncanny X-Men, The First Forsaken, that deals with the idea of Storm moving to Wakanda and taking up residence in Africa. Then of course, there's a Black Panther story which follows that up, where Storm and Black Panther get married. There's also Cable and Deadpool, like bosom buddies and living legends and so on and so forth. We're gonna cover that when Cable and Deadpool drop, or at least when Deadpool 2 comes out. And that brings us to what it is that we're gonna do next. So right now, X-Men Deadly Genesis leads into a few stories. I mean, really, X-Men Deadly Genesis kind of wraps up the decimation branding, so to speak, which is to say the aftermath of House of M. And it starts moving the X-Men into the new era of storytelling, which is really, I call it like the dark age of the X-Men. And that goes into things like Messiah Complex, Messiah War, and all that kind of cool stuff, But because of the fact that Deadpool 2 has been moved up to May from June or July, whatever it was supposed to be, one of the things that I'm thinking about doing is going back to the mid-90s and covering the story of X-Men, of Nate Gray after the events of Age of Apocalypse, and covering the solo series, and then running into Cable and Deadpool. So regardless, the cool thing, remember, when it comes to the the House of M aftermath, and really when it comes to like the X-Men titles as a whole, for the most part, they're really just kind of standalone. You don't have to read through all the X-Men publications. And again, I'll provide a reading order for everything that happens between House of M running up to Deadly Genesis, so you guys can kind of pick and choose what you want to read, but you can read them in isolation if you want to. For example, if for whatever reason you're interested in like Multiple Man and X-Factor, you can just read the X-Factor stories. If you really care about the X-Men, you can read Uncanny X-Men, New X-Men, different things like that. There's a lot of stuff that you can do when it comes to picking and choosing what it is that you want to cover. But Deadly Genesis is a retcon. So for those of you guys who have been on my channel for a while, or you're new to comic books or something like that, and you've heard me reference the phrase of a retcon, this is that in real time. So you're literally gonna be watching it unfold in real time. Now, what this does is it picks up with regards to the Office of National Emergency, but the whole idea behind this was that following the events of decimation, when the Scarlet Witch stripped 98% of the mutant population of their powers, the Office of National Emergency mobilized, and then they basically stationed sentinels around the Xavier Institute to keep anybody from going in and to keep anybody from getting out. And so the X-Men are prisoners, but they're also protected from any external threats. But regardless of the circumstance, what we do is we pick up out in space with a giant chunk of the Earth that was catapulted into space, and it's a guy who basically wakes up. And this is cool, because when this person wakes up, what he does is he basically obliterates the entirety of this astronaut team, and then in turn goes into their ship and starts analyzing everything going on, only to find out that he's in the 21st century. And this is cool because, again, we'll figure out who this guy is because he's actually crazy powerful. But from here, we pick up with, how each individual person is largely dealing with not only the events of decimation, but the vanishing of Charles Xavier. Remember, when it came to the main House of M storyline, one of the things that was established was that Charles Xavier had died, or at least it was believed that he had died. Nobody could find Charles Xavier, and for the most part, he's just largely been presumed dead. And that was the big question people were asking: where's Professor X? And was he just wiped from existence? How did he die? That was a lot of the questions that were being asked here. Now, of course, picking up with Emma Frost and of course the use of Cerebra, which is the huge computer system they use to basically analyze mutants across the planet, different things like that. This is basically one of those attempts where Emma Frost goes in every day and sees whether or not there were new mutants who were popping up. Because remember, from their perspective, the number was reduced. But Beast made a really, really good point. One of the things that Marvel does is they'll use like real world science, but only when it's convenient. And this is one of those things where it's convenient, when they basically say, look, mutant power, whether it's telepathy, whether it's reality warping, whether it's energy projection or what have you, it takes a physical form. When you shoot energy out, that energy comes out, like it impacts things. If it can impact something, it has mass. And according to, the law of conservation of matter, mass can't simply just disappear. Because of the fact that these powers, whether it was telepathy that was influencing the mind of others, whether it was energy projection, someone who can just like shoot energy out of their body or something along those lines, that energy had to have gone somewhere. It can't simply just vanish. Now, as we know, that energy is orbiting Earth. It's just nobody's really aware of it. Most likely because it's kind of a, non-corporeal form, and it's just kind of out there and, just not necessarily detectable. Regardless of the circumstance, with Emma Frost going into Cerebra and trying to analyze whatever mutants are out there, she's suddenly hit by this massive blast of energy that actually knocks her unconscious. And the first question everybody has is, what in the world's going on here? Because remember, Emma Frost is one of the most powerful telepaths in the world. And in fact, right now at this moment with Charles Xavier out of the picture, she's the most powerful telepath telepath on the planet. The fact that somebody was able to overwhelm Emma Frost and send her into a catatonic state is insane, because it means that their power is so extreme that her mind couldn't handle all the energy that was put off. But the fact remains here, because this energy signature emanated from a shuttle, which has since crash landed into the Earth, of course the X-Men respond. The other half of this is that varying members of the X-Men begin to see these like horrific images. For example, Kitty Pryde sees a dead body, Nightcrawler is forced to basically relive his experience living in West Germany, and this is kind of a big deal, because what this means is that all these different mutants are basically being forced to kind of relive some of their most horrific moments in their lives. Once they also arrive onto the scene, they end up finding out like this giant hand was basically reached out of the ground and, you know, grabbed the space shuttle to keep it from smashing into bits. But at this point, we kind of pick up with a couple things that are going on. The first is with Sean Cassidy, and the second is with the arrival of the X-Men. Now, Sean Cassidy has been in Marvel Comics for quite some time, and he was a Chris Claremont creation, I want to say, but he goes by the name of Banshee, and he's actually the love interest of Moira McTaggart, who's long since died in the realm of Marvel Comics. But Sean Cassidy, of course, was head of like Cassidy Keep and part of like the whole Cassidy family. But because of the fact that Moira's been gone for quite some time, when Cassidy, or you know, when Sean basically kind of has these visions where he sees Moira, then the question is, what in the world's going on? So of course, like anybody, he chases after her. Now, the exact same thing happens with the X-Men with regards to like Cyclops and Rachel Summers and so on, showing up where the shuttle crashed, and then Cyclops seeing Jean Grey and chasing after her. Now, of course, once Cyclops and Wolverine chase after Jean Grey, because of course, you know, back in the day, they were both in love with her, they turn the corner only to find out that Rachel Summers has been captured and she's being held by this super powerful guy. Now, picking up with Sean Cassidy for a second, this kind of mental image of Moira McTaggart that he's seeing has led him to this office that she had that he never really knew about. And inside this office, she kind of has like this diary where she basically talks about how terrible of a human being Charles Xavier was, that he was a horrible person, he was manipulative, he was duplicitous, that he didn't really do anything that wouldn't benefit him. Now, this is huge, because this is one of the first times in Marvel Comics where they basically come along and they say that while Charles Xavier on the outset was like really firm and really harsh with students with regards to their training, but was more of a loving father figure, this is them coming back and saying, actually, he was a horrible human being. He was a terrible person. And it's really, really interesting, because when this story first dropped, things like this were huge. But the fact remains here that with regards to the current moment in the X-Men dealing with, you know, Rachel Summers, who's been captured, this guy dominates the X-Men. I mean, it's crazy. Well, really, it's Cyclops and Wolverine, but like dominates them in their entirety. Like he levitates Wolverine, you know, knocks him unconscious. He slows down the impulses to the brain of Rachel Summers, effectively knocking her out. But the coolest display of power, and this is one of the things that I love the most, is when Cyclops goes to shoot his optic blast, the guy forces the blast to go around him and right back to Cyclops, which is cool because we've never seen a person control optic beams like that before. And you know, initially when I saw this, I was like, okay, so this guy's like a reality warper, which is crazy, but he's not. He's not really a reality warper, but he almost might as well be because of the kind of things that he can do. But the fact remains here that we end up having the Office of National Emergency responding due to the fact that the X-Men had basically left the grounds without permission, more or less. They just kind of, you know, flew the coop without telling anybody. And of course, you know, once they arrive, Cyclops and Rachel Summers have been taken and Wolverine's the only one left. And so, I mean, from here, it's kind of a straightforward moment in the sense that Emma Frost and the other X-Men fly over to where the military is hanging out at, where they're holding like Wolverine and so on. And Emma Frost just uses her telepathy in order to free Wolverine. And that's really about it. I mean, it's pretty straightforward in terms of what we would expect for them to break Wolverine out. The cool thing about this comes with Rachel Summers and Cyclops. Now, we'll talk about Rachel Summers here in a second because she's a character that we really need to explain in order for you guys to understand where it is, you know, her character's coming from and why she's here. But the initial exchange between the two of them is that, you know, with this guy basically using his powers to slow down the brain impulses of Rachel Summers, it's all she can do to stay awake. But the other half of this is that where she and Cyclops are talking to one another, what we end up finding out is this guy shut off the powers of Cyclops. Now, technically speaking, this should not be possible. And in truth, it's kind of interesting because this means a couple of different things. One, it means this person can control the mind of Cyclops and effectively turn off his powers, but Cyclops' powers don't work that way. If there's any scenario where Cyclops has his visor off and his eyes open, optic beams are gonna come flying out because his eyes are portals to another dimension. And so what this seems to indicate is that this guy was basically, you know, by virtue of shutting off Cyclops' powers, blocked access to his eyes being portals to this other dimension. And again, if that's the case, it's still pretty extreme. But for the character of Rachel Summers, I want to talk about her for a second. And so Rachel Summers is basically a time-displaced character. One of the things that we've talked about when it comes to Marvel Comics is the nature of like alternate realities. Marvel uses something called branch universe theory. Marvel basically says there's a singular universe, there's the main Marvel universe, and then at some point along the line, you know, events will take place. Like Spider-Man will get the Venom symbiote, and the Fantastic Four will get their powers, and Charles Xavier will form the X-Men or something along those lines. But like an event will occur that will branch off to a different universe. And sometimes it creates a new universe, sometimes sometimes it's the guaranteed future of the existing universe. For example, the guaranteed future of the main Marvel universe was Days of Future Past. At some point in the future, Mystique was going to form a new brotherhood of evil mutants, and they were going to assassinate Senator Robert Kelly, Moira McTaggart, the mutant geneticist, and Charles Xavier. In response, humanity would jumpstart the Sentinel program, the Sentinels would become autonomous, and they would basically conquer North America. That was the absolute future. What Chris Claremont also said is in this future, this Days of Future Past landscape, Jean Grey and Scott Summers would have a daughter named Rachel, and Rachel would have all the powers of Jean Grey and none of the powers of her father. The result is that Rachel Summers would use her powers to send the mind of Kitty Pryde into the past and stop Days of Future Past from happening. Now, this is where Marvel began to experiment with the idea of the multiverse, because the questions fans had is, okay, if the Days of Future Past is a guaranteed future, and then Rachel Summers sends the mind of Kitty Pryde into the past to stop the Days of Future Past, then it creates a paradox. If the Days of Future Past is stopped, then why would Rachel Summers send the mind of Kitty Pryde into the past to stop a future that never happens? And so what Marvel did is they said, well, it's an alternate reality now. Because of the fact that Days of Future Past was stopped, now it's an alternate universe. In that alternate universe, Days of Future Past continues on just like it always did. But the guaranteed future in the main Marvel universe is still unwritten now. We don't really know what that future is going to hold. And so because of that, Marvel started using that as a way to basically explain all these alternate universes, all these alternate realities. But because of the fact that the Days of Future Past became an alternate universe after it was stopped, Rachel Summers didn't understand why her future didn't change. And so in an effort to understand why it didn't change, she traveled into the past. And because she went back, she basically traveled along this line and then back to the point before Days of Future Past was supposed to happen, back before the assassination attempt basically by Mystique and the Brotherhood of Evil Mutants. What it meant is that she jumped from her universe into the main Marvel universe and into the past of the main Marvel universe. And so that created a story called Days of Future Present, alongside like adult Franklin Richards showing up, going insane, different things like that. But the whole idea behind this was that with Rachel Summers in the present day, she was one of those characters that Marvel just kind of brought in and then never really knew what to do with. And so she was rolled over onto like the Excalibur team, different things like that. But she's just kind of been free floating in the Marvel universe ever since, because nobody ever really knew what to do with her. She was originally designed to kind of be a stand-in for Jean Grey, but fans immediately rebuked it. They were like, we do not want anyone but Jean Grey. And so eventually, of course, Jean Grey made her return, different things like that. And Rachel Summers' relationship with Jean Grey was a little tenuous, but it was still a pretty cool scenario. But the fact remains, that's why Rachel's here. So having said that, hopefully we didn't burn your mind out too bad. We didn't fry your brains. But at this point, we pick up with Havoc, with Alex Summers. Now, Alex Summers is actually a pretty cool character when it comes to his whole story. I mean, he just kind of shoots energy and different things like that. The fun fact about this is that he and Cyclops are immune to the other's powers because they're brothers. So it's actually a cool little caveat when it comes to the two of them. But the cool thing about Alex Summers is that this deals with the idea of Iceman Bobby Drake and then Lorna Dane Polaris. And the cool thing was that originally it was Havoc and Polaris who were together, and then she bailed on him for Bobby Drake. And it was kind of cool because that really went into like X Factor, that line of storytelling that kind of dealt with this whole tenuous love triangle. The fact remains, it's really just, Alex Summers being forced to relive these darker memories that he would really just kind of rather avoid. Now, the other half of this is that, again, this guy shows up and just kind of taunts Cyclops to a degree, basically saying, I know everything about you. I know everything that makes you who you are. We've met before. You just don't know it. And so again, it's kind of cool when it comes to these characters interacting with one another, because what we ultimately end up having is Sean Cassidy reaching out to Nightcrawler and Wolverine and saying, hey, look, I have something you guys need to see. It's effectively the last will and testament of Moira McTaggart. And so you guys have to be aware of this. What we end up having is that the actual Blackbird is basically being controlled and is gonna fly directly into the plane that, Sean Cassidy's flying on. He basically jumps out and he intends to try to stop the plane, which he might have been able to do using his voice, but it's just not powerful enough. And the result is that he's actually killed in the explosion, which is big. I mean, it was one of those things where if you were only reading Uncanny X-Men, then basically you had House of M, you had Decimation, and then like 3 story arcs later, Sean Cassidy dies. And it's not really often that Marvel kills off an X-Man like that, at least, a one that's been around for so long. And so it's kind of crazy because the response is, from the X-Men, okay, so anybody who looks at this crime scene is basically going to say, the X-Men's Blackbird tried to fly into a commercial aircraft, a mutant jumped out and was killed in the explosion. What are the X-Men doing? And they're immediately going to come in and they're going to start storming the place. Because remember, the Office of National Emergency kind of takes precedent here. And so while it is one of those things of, hey, we're here to keep you safe, it's also, we can raid your house anytime we want to. We're basically going to have the Office of National Emergency raid the place, trying to figure out what in the world is going on, why someone took the Blackbird and tried to fly it into another facility. Now, picking back up with Alex Summers with Havoc, the cool thing about this too is we end up having this sort of mental image that he picks up when he sees Charles Xavier talking to Corsair. Now, Corsair is a really cool character. Him and the Starjammers were actually really fun. And it was an attempt by Chris Claremont back in the 70s and 80s to kind of expand the greater Marvel landscape. Remember, when it comes to like the Marvel cosmos, one of the things that we talked about is that there were a lot of people who were working on building the Marvel cosmology, but it wasn't a cohesive effort. It's not like Chris Claremont sat down with Jim Starlin and Roy Thomas and said, okay, so like how do we flesh this out? It was one of those things where they each contributed their own piece in isolation from the other. And so Corsair was basically the father of Scott Summers and Alex Summers. Now, what's going on is that this whole idea, at least in terms of Charles Xavier talking to Corsair, what he's really saying is Scott Summers and Alex Summers, they can't know, and it seems to be, seems to indicate that he's telling Corsair, you can't tell them that you're their father. That's the impression that's being put on. What we're actually going to find out is that's not necessarily the case. Not only that, with regards to, everything going on with Scott and Rachel Summers, what we end up finding out is these psychic images that are being put into the minds of people are being done by this guy. He's effectively seizing control of Rachel Summers' mind and then forcing her to put all these images into everybody's head. Now, a lot of this is because of the fact that Charles Xavier kind of left these psychic imprints. What it does is it allows this guy to use the telepathic abilities of Rachel Summers to scan the Xavier Institute and grab these key moments from either his own life or the life of Xavier when he was there, and then broadcast those images into people's minds, or take some of the most horrific moments from their own experiences and force them back into those people's minds. So it's basically this guy pushing the powers of Rachel Summers in order to instigate his own ends. But not only that, Rachel Summers provides these little tidbits where she says, look, when this guy was controlling my mind, I was also reading his a little bit, and I've learned that he trained with the X-Men. And so it's these small little tidbits. This guy was at some point along the line an X-Men, but piecing together this video of Moira McTaggart after raiding the crash site and basically grabbing what it was that Banshee was bringing, Beast and Wolverine kind of break it all down. And in this last little moment, what Moira McTaggart says is that Charles Xavier was a terrible guy because he had gone to Moira McTaggart and asked to use her X-Men and then got them all killed. Now, this is a very important part of her character's history because with Moira McTaggart, she was a mutant geneticist, but it was one of those things where she also helped to harbor and find mutants that were basically kind of cast-offs. Now, whenever it was that she found characters like Wolfsbane or something along those lines, the characters that would basically go on to form the New Mutants, Charles Xavier would serve the purpose of being a training ground for them. So Moira McTaggart and Charles Xavier were actually quite the team, and it was really cool. And so what this does is this jumps back into the whole idea of the Battle of Krakoa. Now, longtime X-Men fans will be well aware of this, and in fact, as soon as this was called X-Men Deadly Genesis, they were like giant size X-Men #1. This goes into the nature of the X-Men, right? And we talked about this before. When Stan Lee, Jack Kirby, Roy Thomas, these major contributors, I think Alan Fine, when they were working on the X-Men stories back in like the 1960s and going into the early 1970s, the X-Men were not popular. After about 63 issues running over the course of like 7 years, the comic was canceled and then reprints were issued for like the next 30 some odd comics. This ran into 1975 when Marvel relaunched with giant size X-Men #1 by Len Wein. And the whole idea is this told the story of Krakoa. And this was basically a living island. It was a sentient island that had captured the X-Men, the original X-Men of Jean Grey and Scott Summers and Iceman, Beast, and Angel. And Charles Xavier had to form a second team, which is where he brought in the new generation of X-Men, Colossus, Nightcrawler, Wolverine, all those guys, the ones that you're most familiar with regards to the X-Men roster. The result is that with those newer characters being rolled in, with them being brought in, what it meant is that fans kind of got the best of both worlds. They got a more diverse lineup of X-Men combined with the X-Men they were already used to. Now, eventually that went out into Bob Layton's whole, initial launch of X Factor with like the first like 5 issues, and then Walter Simonson and Louise Simonson took over and they wrote it for a little while. But the fact remains here that this is how this all kind of kicked off. And this is basically what ends up happening. In the story, we have this flashback of sorts where Charles Xavier shows up to Moira McTaggart and says, okay, my X-Men have been captured and the psychic link I had with them has been cut off, but here's the last few images that I saw before that happened. And it was the X-Men doing the best they could. But the problem is that it seemed as though the X-Men had either been killed or had been captured. And so the result was that the desire of Xavier was to find a way to bring them back. Now, following this, what Xavier did is he had gone to Moira McTaggart and said, I need to use your X-Men team. And so in effect, this was a secret X-Men team that nobody ever knew about. The first of these members was a girl named Sway. And Sway had the ability to like slow down or stop time in a localized space, meaning it was only in like a small vicinity. And so basically it would be like in a bubble. And so if you traveled outside her sphere of influence, time would pass just like normal. But after Sway came became a character by the name of Petra. And Petra was basically a geomorph, meaning she could alter the structure of Earth. She could basically, create things. She was able to evolve a coal into a diamond, different things like that. But she was basically able to manipulate the planet Earth. Following this is the character of Darwin. And we've already done an origin video on him, but Darwin was basically a guy who could adapt to any circumstance. He could adapt to anything. It didn't matter what it was. If it was fire, he wouldn't really feel it. His body would adapt, so the fire wouldn't burn him. If it was dark, he would develop, night vision. I mean, his body would physically adapt to any situation. But one of the more powerful versions of these characters, and one of the most powerful characters on this team, was a kid named Gabriel. And nobody really knew anything about Gabriel's past. All they knew was that he was an orphan somewhere along the line, but his power was to manipulate energy. And it didn't matter what that energy was, exotic, normal, whatever, he could control it and manipulate it. So if you had like a gun and you shot a gun at him, that bullet lets off kinetic energy, he can effectively stop it. That's why one of the arguments that's made is that Vulcan borderlines on reality warping, because everything is composed of energy. And if he can manipulate exotic energy in the form of energy blast or something like that, what would stop him from manipulating the energy of the universe? And so if it's pushed high enough, he could be a reality warping character on the highest order, because he would be manipulating the energy of the universe as opposed to just energy beams and different things like that. So again, Charles Xavier basically enlists these kids, says, hey, look, I need your help. We have to go rescue the original X-Men. They're immediately on board because they're all vying to be part of the X-Men. And so Charles Xavier, instead of training them in real time, throws them into the mindscape, but doesn't tell them. And this is where Charles Xavier starts to demonstrate this kind of duplicitous, dishonest nature in the sense that as far as, Darwin and Gabriel and Petra and Sway, as far as they're aware, it's real. Everything they're experiencing is real, but Xavier is basically tricking them and not necessarily telling them the truth. But the reason why is because they're on a tight schedule. Time is in such short supply. Xavier does not know how long the original X-Men are going to last, and he needs them to be rescued as fast as humanly possible. And so training these characters in the mindscape seems to be the most efficient way to do it, but it's not. And so what ended up happening is Charles Xavier had basically sent these kids out into a mission, and they all got killed. And so what we end up having is Scott Summers, and we end up having Rachel Summers, who basically make their way out of this holding facility that, that this guy was putting him in, and we find out this is Gabriel Summers, that this is the energy manipulator that we were seeing. And he's also the brother of Scott Summers. He's the brother of Cyclops that Cyclops never knew about. Now, the cool thing about this is we do have an origin story on Vulcan, I'm pretty sure. Either it's an origin story or it's an Omega Beyond Omega level video. I can't remember which one. But basically, he's not born of Earth. Instead, what ended up happening is in the history of Cyclops and Havoc, Alex Summers, where, they were basically kind of thrown out of a plane by Corsair when, Corsair and his wife were being kidnapped by the Shiar Empire. And in turn, Cyclops and Havoc were given parachutes and they were said, hey, get to safety, what have you. Where Corsair and his wife were taken by the Shiar Empire to basically be thrown into a workforce. But what we ended up finding out was that Cyclops' mom was about 2 months pregnant by the time that Gabriel had popped up. And so the result was that when they were in the Shiar Empire, she effectively gave birth to him. And then he in turn was thrown into a matrix where his growth was sped up. And then he was just kind of forced into a work camp. Now, eventually he was able to make his escape. He arrived back on Earth. The rest is history. But the idea was that he was just kind of inducted into the X-Men, and that was really about it. And so following this, because of the fact that he's made such a huge display and the fact that, the Office of National Emergency is able to lock onto his energy signature after realizing that he's the one that sent the Blackbird crashing into Banshee, effectively killing him, he of course overpowers the entirety of this Sentinel and kind of obliterates everybody. But his whole stance here, his whole goal is to draw out Charles Xavier, which works. Because when he goes to Muir Island, what we end up finding out is that Charles Xavier's alive. That Charles Xavier is not dead. Not only that, Charles Xavier, when he shows up, basically confirms everything that Gabriel Summers has been saying, that yes, Gabriel Summers is the brother of Cyclops. Yes, Gabriel Summers was one of the members of the secret X-Men team that no one was supposed to know about. And so again, it's a huge deal because what ends up happening is that in response to this, all the other X-Men basically start showing up. And so it's kind of this huge audience that Gabriel Summers was shooting for in the first place. The problem with this is that where Gabriel Summers says, show everyone the truth, use their powers, show everyone the truth, where Charles Xavier shows up with the ability to walk, he also shows up without his powers. And so he can walk around, but he can't use telepathy. And this is kind of like a curse that he really kind of interprets it as. The Scarlet Witch said, fine, I'll give you your legs back, but I'm going to take away your powers just like 98% of the rest of the mutant population. And so the result is that we end up having this branching scenario that takes place, where Rachel Summers steps up and says, okay, fine, you can use my mind to broadcast the truth into the minds of everybody else. And again, this is where we end up finding out the whole situation, that this Gabriel Summers-led X-Men team did show up, they did seem to rescue the original X-Men, but Cyclops was the only one who was able to get away with the help of the original team. Where Cyclops took off, where he was told, go find help, that the reality of the situation was that for Gabriel Summers and for Charles Xavier himself, that this X-Men team was seemingly obliterated. The living island had basically adapted itself to all of their attacks. It killed Sway, it killed Petra, it seemed to kill Darwin, and it seemed to kill kill Vulcan, or at least that seemed to be the case. The problem with this was that while this battle was going on and these younger X-Men were being killed, Charles Xavier modified the memories of Cyclops so that Cyclops would believe the island sent him back to the X-Men to find more mutants, which is what the original Giant Size X-Men #1 story told us. And so what we end up finding out here is that Charles Xavier messed with the mind of Cyclops, tricked him into believing something happened that didn't actually happen, and in turn, the rest of the mutants that were left on that island, they all effectively died. Now, Gabriel Summers and Darwin technically lived, but nobody else knew that. And so when Charles Xavier had rounded up this new generation of X-Men, Colossus, Nightcrawler, Wolverine, so on and so forth, and sent them to the island alongside Cyclops to rescue the original X-Men team, where that version was successful and Jean Grey took the giant landmass and shot it into space, what they didn't know is that Vulcan and Darwin were still in that chunk of land. And so because of that, they were basically sent out there, and they were just kind of floating in space. Darwin basically merged with Gabriel Summers in order to keep him alive, and then they've just kind of floating there ever since. Because of the events of House of M, with this massive amount of energy being given off by the 98% of mutants that lost their powers, it woke up Gabriel Summers. It kicked him up out of this, catatonic state. And then he in turn went on this warpath because he remembered virtually everything. And the question was, why doesn't anybody else know? And so as a result of this, Darwin basically reconstitutes himself, more or less, because it's Darwin. And in response to this, with Cyclops learning the truth that his mind had been tricked by Xavier, that Xavier was being duplicitous, he was lying, Cyclops kicks him out of the Xavier Institute and says, you're no longer welcome here. This works because remember, Cyclops and Emma Frost have been running the Institute following the vanishing of Charles Xavier. They've been running it for quite some time. Not only that, as far as Cyclops says, he says, you're not a mutant. You don't have telepathy anymore, so you don't really even have a place here. If we've told every person that's not a mutant that they can't come here, that same rule has to apply to you. So you have to leave. And so what this does is it sets in motion the story called Rise and Fall of the Shiar Empire, where basically Gabriel Summers races into space in order to gain vengeance against the Shiar Empire, who are responsible for the death of his mother and the presumed torture of his father, Corsair, and so on and so forth. But with that being said, guys, we're going to bring this video to an end. If you are new here to Comics Explained, make sure you guys hit the sub button to become part of the Rob Corps. If you guys enjoyed this video, make sure you drop a like, and I will catch you all later. Peace.